Okay, well, good morning, slightly good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gail Whiteman. I'm the Hoffman Impact Professor for Accelerating Action on Nature and Climate at the University of Exeter. I'm in the business school, so that is my background as a business school professor, and earlier was in the private sector. I'm really delighted today to be the chair of the C-Suite Guide launch, our webinar. Because I think the issue of nature and climate is incredibly important in the landscape. It has been the case for some time that biodiversity is under pressure both in the UK and around the world, but we can also see that the issues of material risk are escalating for companies in the UK and around the world. And indeed, we've got a mixed bag of policy uptake, certainly if we take a look around the world. I'm Canadian, I'm not from the US, so I will not make any specific references to that administration, but I do want to say that I think we've got a great program today, and I think the guide itself, which we are launching, is something that I'm incredibly proud of to be a small part of. We're going to open with two presentations. The first one will be by Dr. Ryan Nolan. He's Associate Professor of Circular Economy and Organization at the University of Salford Business School. Before that, he was on my team as a research fellow with Renew's Business and Finance theme. He's done a really excellent job on research in this area, looking at a variety of different things. And then we will follow that by a presentation by Noel Moran. Noel is our professor in practice at the University of Exeter, working in this area, and it was a huge delight to bring Noel onto the team because I knew him previously because of his very in-depth experience in the private sector and through his role with a liaison delegate member for Stora Enso with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So Ryan, if I can turn the floor over to you for a short presentation, then we will move towards Noel, and then we will keep going to get some feedback from others. And as Noel as Ryan is setting up, you can download now.
Exactly. And I hope somebody might post a link to the guide in the chat as well while I'm speaking. Yeah, thanks everyone. So before we get into the guide that you should be able to access via a link in the chat, and we'll return to the QR code a little bit later.
Freezing, isn't it?
It's thought it's worth taking a moment to explain the research that we did a little bit, how it was designed and how it was conducted. So this strand of work focused on understanding the information barriers and scientific enablers to corporate action on nature and biodiversity. And alongside that, we were interested in developing and understanding a little bit more the different types of corporate actors there were. So coming up with a way of mapping where different kinds of companies are in their nature journey and what that means for how they engage with the issue. If you flick through the guide when you get a chance to open it, you'll see the results of this throughout, but in particular, the work on our typology is in the section called 6 Types of Companies. Where do you stand? Our priority from the outset was to engage with people in businesses, and we wanted, really prioritize quality of conversation over quantity. So rather than casting the net as wide as possible with a big survey or something like that, we focused on reaching well-positioned people in sustainability leadership roles, in finance, involved in strategic decision-making, essentially people who sit close enough to both the ambition and the operational realities to give us genuinely useful insights on this topic. We had more than a helping hand with leading UK business networks, including the UK Business and Biodiversity Forum, UK Business Council for Sustainable Development, Business in the Community, Sustainable Investor, which used to be ESG Investor, IMS Consulting, the CBI, Business for Nature, and the Environmental Services Association. And we're pleased to have Mark, Emma, and Graham here with us today, who were really important to the work at every stage. Helping us access interviewees, bringing credibility and reach, the sort of strength and the quality of the people that we spoke to. And they also participated in focus groups to bring their own perspectives and the creation of the guide itself through peer review and iterations of feedback. In terms of methodology, we combined several approaches throughout the sort of stages of the work, beginning with a literature review, to ground what we subsequently did in existing evidence. And then we conducted semi-structured interviews, so a series of interviews with people in businesses, which gave people the space and freedom to speak in their own terms and sort of give us little threads to follow as we spoke to more and more people. We complemented this with a focus group, which allowed us to kind of say some of our ideas out loud and see what resonated and perhaps what we needed to develop a little bit further. And then ultimately ending in the co-production of the C-Suite guide, which went through several rounds of feedback and iteration with some of the people on the call today, and probably quite a few of the people on the call today, and some of those speaking as well. So rather than coming in with pre-formed ideas, really the whole point was to speak to people, hear from people, and see what emerged from that. The result, we hope, is both rigorous and useful, grounded in real experience, and tested a little bit before launch. So yeah, we're really looking forward to sharing with you all today. So I'm briefly just going to talk about some of the barriers we encountered before passing over to Noel, who's going to say a bit more about the enablers and the things that people can do right now. So though our primary research with executives and senior leaders across the UK, we've identified 6 recurring barriers that keep companies from fully engaging with the biodiversity and nature problems. These we found weren't necessarily unique to any one specific sector or size of organization. We spoke to people from all over the place in all different types of businesses. But these are the things that were showing up consistently, and understanding them is perhaps the first step to beginning to move past them. So the first is the external environment itself. So the policy and market signals that drove climate action, like carbon pricing, regulation, investor pressure, are still catching up when it comes to nature. That makes the business case a bit more difficult to land, perhaps internally, and it means that companies can feel like they're acting ahead of the curve without a clear guide or clear commercial incentive or reward. And that's a real challenge, but it's also a window of opportunity for those willing to move early. The second barrier is salience. Nature simply hasn't found its place on most strategic agendas yet. In many boardrooms, it sits below perhaps climate, below quarterly performance, and a whole long list of other complex and equally necessary competing priorities. And it's partly a framing problem, and it's one that can be addressed with strong leadership, and we saw that time and again through our interviews. Third, even where ambition does exist and things are happening, it can lose momentum without clear ownership and aligned incentives. So when nature sits in a single team rather than being thought about as a collaboration problem or a strategic risk and opportunity area, it tends to drift and get bunched in with other things, and other agendas start to perhaps take over a little bit more, things that are on the immediate horizon. Fourth is expertise, which often does exist in organizations, but it doesn't always reach the people and processes where decisions are made. Some concepts, they are complex concepts and not easily graspable on a single slide, get lost in translation between specialist teams and executive functions, managerial functions. And some businesses have to lean heavily on external consultants, which can generate momentum, but also risks slowing the internal capability building that makes things longer lasting. Fifth is the data challenge. So there is a data challenge. Unlike perhaps carbon, greenhouse gases, there isn't a single universal metric, in air quotes, for a company's nature footprint. And it's really it is a complex problem, but it's also become a reason to stall. So waiting for perfect information rarely serves anyone. And a pragmatic starting point we've been hearing is, with the right indicators refined over time, through iteration, through trial and error, is probably better than waiting for the perfect thing to come along. And sixth, finally, some companies that are actually doing good work are choosing to go quiet about it, what's sometimes called green hushing. And this is the fear of scrutiny, and it's understandable. But silence itself also carries risks. regulatory, reputational, and in terms of the collective learning that the whole sector, all sectors needs this kind of trial and error, failing fast type approach. So these are some of the barriers, and they are very real, but they are also potentially manageable. And I'm going to pass over to Noel, who's going to put some more of the positive spin on some of this. Thanks, Noel.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. I want to talk about this really from the perspective of business. The C-Suite guide, just for anybody who isn't up to speed on this, the C-Suite is basically the top ranking senior executives, usually in a company, but it could be not for profit either. And the C really reflects this titles. Usually the titles start with chief or chair. So C being chief executive, chief financial officer, chief sustainability officer, etc. So I just wanted to reiterate that before we move on. Next slide, please, Ryan. The other thing is that we're not coming at this afresh. There's been reference to carbon. Work started in carbon in the early 2000s. Sustainable Development Goals were launched 10 years ago. Two particular goals, 14 and 15, refer to life on land and life underwater. So that set the whole process in motion a decade ago. 3 years ago then, we had science-based targets for nature launched. We also had, alongside that, the task force for nature-related financial disclosure. Both of those inspired by similar work on carbon. And this is a recurring theme, and anybody in business will recognize it. More recently, we had the IPBES plenary in Manchester. One of our later speakers was heavily involved in that, Mark. Business and biodiversity assessment was heavily referenced in that. And even today, or rather yesterday, we had Earth Day for many years in a row now. So we're coming to this, not new, but with a very clear history of what's been required. Next slide, please. The co-creation process for me was very important coming in as a business or former business leader. I worked internationally for many, many years. And my ambition from day one was to bring the outside in, to team up the best academics with the best business networks and individual businesses that we could find in the UK and internationally. And as Ryan said, and you saw it on his slide, we ended up with 8 networks that helped us in various ways. So I think that gave us a very solid basis. It legitimizes the work, and it also tested the academic theories in reality. And we'll hear from 3 of those later on. But what I want to do now is I want to look at 2 particular aspects of, let's call it, implementation, because I'm the how guy, or at least that used to be my role in the companies I worked in. How do you do this? How do you do that? And this is a lot now framed in the context of operational risk, or it will be, if not already, but also opportunity. We got 2 pieces that I want to cover briefly. What enables success, and in some ways that's a reflection of the barriers that Ryan described earlier, and also the how. What sort of actions need to be taken? And the interesting thing is that in the interviews we carried out last year, companies up and down this country, large, medium, and small, gave us fantastic examples of actions they were taking. Sometimes in the context of those frameworks that I mentioned earlier, sometimes because they wanted to do it anyway. The challenge is that enlightened self-interest, as some people call it, is in short supply at the moment, given many of the external geopolitical games that are being played at the moment. So that can't be the defining factor. Next slide, please, Ryan. Let's get into then these enablers. So what enables success? We identified basically 5 factors. Next slide. Regulation and markets are fundamentally important to business. It's extremely difficult for businesses to engage easily in anything when external signals are not consistent and not long-term. And we've seen a lot of toing and froing. It makes it very difficult to plan, particularly if you're in large, heavy industries. I worked in industries were working on 100-year life cycles. I wasn't in fast tech. I wasn't into break it fast and fix it. If you set out on a journey and allocate capital, you got to be pretty much heading in the right direction for decades. And these industries all had large landscape impacts. So commitment around nature and biodiversity in terms of regulatory drivers and market drivers or voluntary action is just as important. The other thing is that the stakeholders that are involved, those that are really legitimate, also need to understand this, that business can't move fast, but it can move very well when it knows where it needs to get to. And we talked about science-based targets for nature and the TNFD. These are voluntary initiatives, and so much of this is still voluntary. It depends on the goodwill and the good nature of the C-suite, and that's why we focus on the C-suite. But let's move on then to the next point. That takes you into leadership. The C-suite, we chose that as the target audience for this work because they are the key leaders. They basically determine what the ambition should be. They're the ones that call the action or call for action. They set the priorities. Most importantly, they free up resources, both money and people, so that gets priority over competing things. And business is always about competition and calculated risk. And they reward success and hopefully don't have to deal with the failures. One of the things we did is find through our work, particularly the help we got from Business for Nature, which was the only international network that we teamed up with. They have a very nice framework already in place called ACT-D, and it basically stands for assess, commit, transform, and then disclose. And that's covered, there's references to that in the guide. Next point, please. Vision is great, ambition is great, C-suite is great. I've been there, I've done all that, but it doesn't actually move the dial. The dial gets moved through integration of systems and strategy. Successful implementation requires that nature and biodiversity are fully integrated into core business processes, operational systems upstream and downstream of the company. Because, of course, no company is an island. No matter how big you are, you depend on somebody upstream to give you something, and you depend on somebody downstream to buy your product or service. So fundamentally, in business, what gets measured gets managed. And I'll come back to that later. Fourth point, then move on again, Ryan, thanks. It's very important that we have the right cultures in place, that empowerment exists, and that the incentives are aligned. Far too often I've seen, and we encountered it in the interviews, misaligned incentives, where somebody really wants to do something right, but the bonuses are set in the wrong direction, or the career development opportunities go in a different way. Capability can scale when culture is supportive, and that's a very important concept. So it's not just about the strategies and the systems and the processes and the C-suite. You really got to get the culture right. It's what's in people's heads, it's what's in their hearts, as well as what's in the business plan. Evidence we found, again, from many of the interviewees, even small, well-placed projects can unlock really outsized learning and generate momentum. The challenge is that they need to be linked to a plan. A good case study is nice, but a good case study linked to a strategy is really nice. Next one, please. The fifth point then here is about collaboration and knowledge and partnerships. Like I say, no company's an island, so we really need to find ways to be creative around non-traditional networks and relationships. These can allow the creation of a common ground to move forward. They can help to produce decision-useful information or evidence. They also spread the risk and the cost. It can be quite scary to be a first mover, particularly at the moment. The economies everywhere are under pressure. There's a lot of geopolitical pushback. There's this green hushing that Ryan mentioned earlier. That's all real. They're all, spoiling the party, basically. So we need to find a way to move that on through these what I call non-traditional networks. And also engaging the experts, as Ryan said, to bring in expertise, but not to use expertise to displace or replace expertise that's required in-house. So they are the enablers. I'm just conscious of time here. Let's look at the next thing really, which is how do you then build some action on top of this? We've suggested a 4-tier model, and this isn't an academic model. This is a model that's based on practical reality that's been distilled out over many years by many companies. And if you really get to the nub of what action looks like, it requires 4 steps. You've got to map your externalities. What are the opportunities and the threats on anything, not just nature and biodiversity? There are tools developed in the business world now, and a lot of what I'm talking about now is about business. It's not about science, it's not about nature, it's not about biodiversity, it's about business. These tools already exist. This framework exists. You need a double materiality assessment to understand the impact going out of the company and the impact coming in. TNFD has produced a really nice framework there called the LEAP framework. L stands for locate, E stands for evaluate, A is assessment, and P is prepare. Again, that's a ready-made, in the oven product that could be deployed by any company that wants to do it today. And we came across companies that do. Unfortunately, like science-based targets and TNFD, the uptake is still very, very short. Next one, please. You got to define the company response. What are your policies? What are your strategies? What's the vision? What's the ambition? You got to be courageous, and you've got to set long-term direction and publicly declare at some point that you're going to make these commitments in a way that's understandable to everybody. Next one, please. Operationalize. You need processes, procedures, systems, certification. None of this is new. You also need assurance. You've got to convince people that you're walking the talk. And you've got to develop the next one, which is the evidence. Next slide, please. Evidence can be quantitative, a case study, like I say, but a case study on its own can be interpreted as greenwash. So you've got to really put it into a systems framework. And ultimately, and ideally, it needs to be quantitative. But as we know, with a multidimensional set of topics around nature and biodiversity, this is not easy, not even for the best scientists or anybody else that's doing this in the world. Next slide, which is the last one. You got to be pragmatic. You don't expect to know everything on day one. Nobody does. None of the people we spoke to here or in the university or anywhere else know it all. It's a voyage of discovery, and you got to allow time. You need processes, you need indicators. The processes need to be looked at performance and how you're embedding what you're doing. There's another tool for that, which is well used in business. If you haven't got those things already in place yourself, it's called the STAR model. And it looks at aligning all the different moving parts in a company around 5 components so that they're all aligned to optimize the opportunity to maximize the success and minimize the failure. This is all described in some detail and references, etc., in the guide. So with that, I will hand back to Gail, and she can then take us into the sessions with our 3 network responders. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Noel and Brian. Perfect timing. And I would have to say that just from my perspective, having been again at the World Economic Forum at Davos this year, the issue of how to keep the nature agenda front and center in the business community was definitely a side conversation, although it did not have as much prominence in previous years. So I think this work is really well placed. But I am a professor, so I think what's more important is for us to now get feedback from the business community. And I'm delighted to be able to invite short commentaries from 3 different folks. And I'm going to start off with Dr. Mark Johnston. He's chair and director of the UK Business and Biodiversity Forum. He's been involved in this project since the get-go. He was in discussions, I believe, with Dr. Peter White, who was our first professor in practice of this Renew project. So Mark, if I can turn over to you, love to hear what your reflections are on the guide and how you see business action evolving in this area.
Of course. Well, thank you much, Gail. Thank you, Noel and Ryan, and thank you everybody and the team in Renew for his work. It's a great report. And yeah, it's great actually to see that academia and business come together to produce this report. So it's a great to see that synergy between the two institutions. That's fantastic, and also it's very timely. So this is going to be another busy year for biodiversity and businesses. As Halsey highlighted, we had the IPBES assessment, which came out in February, and the full report is due at any time, which highlights the importance of the interaction between businesses and biodiversity. And of course, we've got the UN CPD COP17 in October. So another big highlight for biodiversity. So thank you. So first of all, just highlight, I'm Mark Johnson. I am one of the directors of the UK Business Biodiversity Forum, and also quite actively involved. And again, thank you for participation of businesses in this space. So yeah, absolutely, it is critically important that businesses understand and integrate biodiversity into decision making, understand the impacts, dependencies, and risks. And your report, the new report, highlights that in terms of that importance. As highlighted by IPBES, transformative change is needed if we are to get anywhere near the global biodiversity, the GBF goals and targets for 2030 and 2050, reverse the loss of biodiversity, and businesses play an absolutely critical role in achieving that. Businesses can't do that in isolation. And again, that's very much highlighted within the report. I just want to a couple of quick reflections on terms of highlight a couple of things in the report. There's a nice statement saying that I think right at the beginning of the report, put biodiversity and nature explicitly in the board and in executive on the executive agenda. Absolutely, it needs to be at the top. And sometimes we see that businesses are not able to take the actions that some of the businesses wanted to take within the company because it's not on the board level. It's not getting the uptake or understanding at that sort of level. So it is really important that the boards are talking about these issues. And some of these issues are material risks to businesses, but businesses need to understand what they actually are. In terms of, I really like that about you identify the barriers, and thank you, Ryan and Noel, for talking through that, the enabling actions and the recommendations within the report itself. On the barriers, I highlighted, you mentioned about external signals in the economies and short-termism. This external signals is really interesting, and talk about the business case, Noel, and it's really important. But we are seeing having to continuously re-emphasize the business case of why it's important. And that's because businesses are continuously bombarded by changing conditions in the market, different priorities. So reinforcing that message about the importance of nature will always continue, and that's again reinforced by the actual report itself. We all keep coming back to data and metrics and complexity of data. And of course, as the report highlights, there's no universally accepted metric. There are a lot of different ways of measuring biodiversity out there. But I personally, I think sometimes we get too bogged down in the complexity of data and metrics, and it's actually not that complicated as it perhaps we sometimes make out it to be. But that's perhaps more my own personal reflections, and we can have a further discussion on that piece. So perhaps I want to just move on to the recommendations and insights to action, which is great to see. It's nice to see that condensed down into really sort of 4 buckets of actions that business need to be taking. Coming back to the externalities, map what matters and prioritize is really important. That's going to vary from business to business, from sector to sector. So the board and different entities within the company need to understand that. And then also set ambitious targets or positions or policies to address those. But I think at the same time, it's also important to realize the challenges in perhaps setting those ambitions or in prioritizing those, because some of these things are not easy. But just being transparent about those challenges, so the fact you may not reach a particular ambition or particular target, but actually sharing the lessons learned you achieve as you go through that process of achieving your ambitions or targets is really important as part of collective action. Back in, only 5-6 years ago, back in the sort of the 2020s, early 2020s, we saw a lot of businesses setting very ambitious sustainability goals, ambitions, etc. And we saw that quite a lot of companies setting that out. But things have changed in a very short time. Lockdown and COVID, Ukraine war, conflict at the moment in the Middle East. These will have a big impact on the way business operate. So being very clear and focusing on what matters, what is the priority for the company, and being quite open about the challenges, I think is really important. And I think, as you highlighted, as I think is one of them is about being realistic, evidence journey, just showing your progress towards that ambition and target, and Finally, as nicely highlighted, the integration, operationalization, embedding nature into everything you do, from the culture to the processes, the procedures, the requirements in the company, is really important, because that's what makes it enduring and systematic. Because CEOs change, executives change and move on, but businesses keep going. And that's that integration, which is really important, which you've highlighted. But it does need to have the sign-off and the approval at the executive level to really work. So that's my reflections. Thank you very much, and I'll hand back to you, Gail. Thank you very much.
Perfect timing, Mark. I must say that you British speakers are all exactly on time. So my job has become very, very easy, unlike in North America, where I have to wrestle it a little bit. So thank you very much for those thoughts, Mark. I'd like to now invite Emma Weaver, who's the Climate Action Manager at Business in the Community, to give her business reflections on our C-Suite guide. Emma, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gail. So quickly, Business in the Community is a responsible business network, and I design programs that are aligned to the TCFD and the TNFD. So reading Renew's C-Suite guide was a fantastic way to kick off my week, and I've been obviously reflecting on the recommendations since. So working on business-led nature and resilience strategies and climate action programs generally, real progress and robust strategy typically doesn't start until senior leadership is convinced of the value. So if you've read the report, obviously this is a key theme, so leadership, commitment and vision, which Noel mentioned. I think there are key lessons to be learned from sustainability teams with the focus on reducing carbon emissions to date. In the pursuit of integrating nature stewardship, I think we need to be careful, so understanding what's valuable and should be inherited, but also what has been detrimental and perhaps inhibited progress. So there are three main points that I would like to make. Firstly, that I think what really makes the report stand out is the categorization of types of businesses. So from agenda setters to unengaged firms. I would say that most businesses are within that kind of pressured beginners group. However, if they had C-suite backing, obviously they could become emerging leaders. Unfortunately, as everyone's mentioned, geopolitical tensions and macroeconomic challenges, that has presented a few backsliders. However, they might not be sliding back as much as it seems. The growing kind of depublicizing movement in ESG has been highlighted at our member conference in January, and we have been advising them to resist this, of course. So I'm going to speak quickly about a business case study that fits within these categories. So in Renew's paper, it outlines how it's difficult to find nature strategies outside of traditional sectors, so infrastructure, utilities, construction, and extractive industries. However, in BITC's recent report that I authored, the Nature and Resilience Insights, we showcased a study by Standard Life. This is a retirement savings and income business, and they presented their methodology for identifying nature-related priorities within its investment portfolio. So obviously outside of these typical kind of sectors. They were looking at how to obviously improve their task force for nature-related financial disclosures reporting. I would say Standard Life is a trailblazer, as they developed a methodology that combined quantitative and qualitative analysis, conducting an initial assessment of their portfolio, or a portion of their investment portfolio. So they focused on their listed equity and listed credit portfolio only. Their quantitative analysis looked at Encore and SBTN sectoral materiality tool to provide data on their direct and upstream impacts and dependencies. And then this was overlaid with their qualitative assessments and professional judgments. So the group were able to identify that rising water scarcity and land use change as two of their key issues within their portfolio. And then they also published position statements on these areas. So the second recommendation that stands out to me is about integration, and Noel has mentioned this, so excuse me if I'm kind of repeating what others have said, but speaking the language of those that you're trying to influence and not getting caught up in the technical detail that specialists love. This way, obviously, nature can be truly integrated as senior executives understand why it's important, and so they can get behind the idea. It also solves the barrier of capacity, but this has been, described already. So I'll move on to my final reflection, which is around recognizing fragmented information. The issue isn't that there isn't enough guidance, it's that the amount is overwhelming for businesses. So I think what this report is excellent in doing is signposting to Act D and the LEAP process, which are proven kind of structured ways to kind of understand your dependencies and impacts on natural capital. So I'll finish off with saying the timing is great for Renew's report. I have mentioned the Nature and Resilience Insights paper that BITC has published. Highlighting leadership endorsement has been like a key point within this paper. So I will be signposting to the C-Suite engagement guide as the next step on this. So yeah, those are my reflections, and I'll pause because I'm not sure whether I'm at time.
Well, Emma, you had 1 more minute if you wanted to extend, or if not, we could just use that in the discussion. I did want to suggest that you put the link to your report in the chat. I think it's a perfect complement, so please do that. And I'd like to now invite Graham Sprigg onto the virtual stage, so to speak. Graham is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of IMS Consulting in Europe, so he's got a broader reflection than just in the UK. But if I may ask you, Graham, if you could give your reflections on our C-Suite guide. Over to you.
Thanks, Gail. Yes. Yeah, it's a few sort of thoughts and reflections on the guide. We've been working with Noel and Ryan and the team prior to the launch of the guide, hopefully giving some constructive advice and criticism, really coming at it from a point of view of what large corporates are looking at the moment. Just to echo the sort of the views of the previous speakers, I think the guide has come out at absolutely the right time. It's the right time and it's the right level of detail. I think it's a very pragmatic guide, and just sort of looking at some of the barriers that Ryan mentioned at the outset. I think one of the most important aspects of the report is that it's identified these barriers very clearly, and of those, particularly the ownership and data complexity, which companies face problems with when they're measuring and reporting nature. We've talked in the previous presentations about carbon, and really up until fairly recently, most of the focus of companies on the E of ESG, the environment side, has been on measuring and reporting carbon emissions, and that's now well understood. And to a certain extent, a lot of the things that we've learned through that journey can be applied to the way that nature is looked at. But I think one of the big differences now is that the world is a very different place. It's a very unstable environment that we're working in. Just over the last few months, we've seen quite a lot of changes which have impacted the way that companies approach their reporting in particular. And one of the barriers that Ryan mentioned was this concern about scrutiny, the green hushing thing, and that's become more prevalent really over the last 18 months due to the political situation, where a lot of companies, particularly some of the businesses that we work with, the corporate multinationals, there's actually a disincentive to be too transparent about what they're doing to reduce their impact. But the other crucial thing, I think, is that the regulatory frameworks for reporting now are much more sophisticated and probably some would say much more onerous than they have been in the past. So things like TNFD, originally was seen as a sort of an opportunity to report on the finance-based platform, but a lot of the work that companies did around that, particularly on double materiality, Noel mentioned about double materiality analysis, didn't end up being particularly useful because it was adopting a bottom-up approach, and it became far too onerous for companies to really get engaged in that sort of thing. So that the sort of the new regime, as it were, in terms of reporting, gives us a better framework to work to. But I think that the key thing really with the C-Suite guide is it gives some practical guidance on how companies should move forward. It's difficult at the moment for businesses to really prioritize what they need to do when there isn't a sort of regulatory imperative. So what this guide does is, I think it really sort of brings home the benefits of early mover advantage, which companies will get. The majority of corporates obviously take nature-based activities very seriously, but it can be seen as something which is put into the too complicated box, because it's not as straightforward as perhaps it would seem to actually measure and report on the impact that the company has on nature. So as I say, I think the report it's right time, right place. I think where the real benefits of the report will come, certainly with the companies that IMS is working with, is using it as a pragmatic guide as to what can be done and where the focus should be really, and the enablers for success, those that Noel touched on. If we use those as a framework to move things forward, I think that'll be really useful. As I say, there's no legislative imperative at the moment for companies to do things, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't really be moving forward even more quickly than we have been in the past. So I think this sort of guide is going to be a really useful tool for companies, large and small, to be able to apply to their activities and their impacts on nature. How are we doing on time, Gail?
No, you've got another minute or so, Graham.
A minute or so, okay. Well, if I could say then, the way that companies are likely to apply this, it's if we use the example of carbon reporting, carbon measurement and reporting as a sort of model. In the early days, it was very difficult for companies to engage with their C-suite. Sustainability teams, they had a lot of good ideas and a lot of they were very well-meaning, but until the C-suite were engaged, it was very difficult to get any traction. I think the big difference now is particularly on the financial side of C-suite, CFOs in particular, because of the way that reporting regulations have shifted. Things like TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, there's more synergy now between what sustainability teams are doing, so the CSO, and the finance teams, the CFO. And I think that's a good foundation for an opportunity for nature-based reporting to really move ahead quickly. Thanks,
well,
Gail.
Thank you very much, Graham, Emma, and Mark. We're going to move into the discussion side. And if I could have all of those speakers, including Noel and Ryan, turn their screen on. I want to kick off. I know we've got some questions in the chat. Please do. And also, please feel free to put your hand up and ask your question directly. But I guess, I'm really struck by this, both the green hushing, the pressure, but then also how do we, sort of cue that C-suite courage to maybe swim up a river, so to speak. And Patrick Quaya, who is one of RENEW'S PhD students, and he's on the call, he's just published a really excellent paper where he documents, based on a number of interviews, how actually people's personal experiences with nature sort of created a light bulb moment that carried on through the rest of their career and that they used when things got tough. I'm just wondering, anecdotally, does that make sense to you? Or is it more there's a shock from a lawsuit or a material risk? What is it that kind of gets people when the going is tough? And Patrick, if you could please put a link in the chat to your paper. So just jump in.
I'll jump in if nobody else will, but I'd rather others had the floor.
Oh, kick off, Noel. Kick off. Come on.
Go for it,
Okay.
Noel.
From practical experience, I'm the business guy, I'm the how guy. The personal experience becomes very important, and Emma works for business in the community. I ran its main campaign many, many years ago by coincidence. And back then, I'm not sure if they still do it now, but they had a program within their membership. And I think Business in the Community is, what, 500 members or more, Emma? Yeah. They had the Seeing is Believing trips.
Oh, I love it.
And it was to expose the C-suite, because membership of Business in the Community is targeted at the C-suite, to expose those individuals to particular sustainable development link, / community issues. Might be social, might be environment. It was hugely important because very few people are fundamentally evil. But when you're in a business, you're constrained by all sorts of things that make it difficult always to follow your heart as well as your head. And these sorts of opportunities then lead the way. A practical experience again. I was the first in the in the industry I was in at the time, which was a quarrying company, to sign an MOU with one of the world's largest nature conservation organisations, BirdLife International, RSPB in the UK. We had a partnership where I negotiated that their directors from around the world went on our management development programs with the very people who were digging up the rock. Both sides into a learning environment, usually residential, where they spent time together learning about stuff, not about digging holes in the ground or protecting birds. And it built all sorts of unusual relationships, which overcame some of this concern about trying to make progress. So I think you have to be a bit creative. I mentioned these sort of non-traditional relationships and non-traditional networks. Now is the time. The world needs a different way of working. I think we can all say that, not just for nature and biodiversity. So we've got to really start to break down the traditional ways of working and start working across the boundaries, not just business to business, a la World Business Council, but business to NGO or business to society. Because these are all common challenges.
If I can interrupt, no, I'm just wondering if that resonates with others, both that were our speakers and anybody in the audience that is also, or challenge it actually, that's not sufficient, that what we really need are some other things. I know it's a complicated thing, but I'd just like to get some dynamics in the room. Graham.
Gail. Yeah, I think what Noel says is very interesting because in some respects, this is an easier problem to solve than the getting engagement in climate issues because nature is visible. It's all around us. Everybody can see it. The other thing is that we're probably, hopefully, we're far more advanced than companies and NGOs were 20 years ago when Noel started working with BirdLife International, because in those days, business was seen as bad largely by NGOs, whereas now there's the benefits of relationships are much more apparent and much more obvious. So I think there's a big opportunity I'm not sure educate the C-suite is the correct phrase, but to actually get early engagement with these people and see what can actually be done.
Great. Any other thoughts on that area?
I can follow on.
Yeah, please go ahead, Emma.
I can follow on from Noel on the Seeing is Believing, because we had one as part of our future-proofing communities in Teesside and Middlesbrough, and that focused on food security, so obviously in the intersection with social and environmental justice. And then also another case study by Shoesmiths, as they've engaged their C-suite in a kind of strategy half day. And what they did is they provided a variety of resources, so from like books, documentaries, and podcasts. So I think it's almost having like a strategy day, but also pre-reads, so they can get their head around it in a variety of ways also.
Yeah. And if we move on to sort of this idea about how to overcome some of the barriers, I mean, I think there's good research that both Noel and Ryan have shown on enablers, but nonetheless, we do know some of the barriers have been growing. Perhaps we don't have research to support the best way to get over those barriers, particularly this, the pressure to green hush. But in your experience, what seems to be mechanisms or approaches that can give a company's courage, even if they don't publicly report on what they're doing, but to continue to invest in areas that are nature positive? Mark, Graham, Emma, any suggestions on that?
I think, sorry, Gail. I mean,
Yeah,
from
please
the
go
point of view of a lot of the clients that we work with, it's proof from others. So I think case studies are really important in this sort of area where it's almost more impactful to be able to see what happens if you don't do something than if you do something. So we mentioned early mover advantage before. Companies that have actually walk the walk, as it were, and done something, that's a good incentive for others to follow suit.
Great. Mark, in your experience, what do you think?
No, I certainly absolutely agree with that point in terms of that sort of engagement and getting to the board level, breaking down some of those barriers. And in terms of just also there's other aspects of into just general awareness, understanding. Some teams, people often see biodiversity being relatively complicated, and it's not in terms of the actions they can take. I think perhaps maybe it's more about the environment, but I was encouraging what people were saying about finance in terms of it's interesting to see that they are increasingly linking nature to finance, and you're seeing that putting the value on nature in some sort of capacity is actually helping to get it into that language. So just changing the language into talking about natural capital or nature finance or investments in nature gets the attention more on the board. To break down some of those issues.
Right. And what about, there's a lot of different board training things. So if you want to be a board member, you take the FT course, for example, to be a director. Is nature featuring in those board qualifications, or is it still sort of a nice to have?
I'd certainly be seeing more of it, which is great to see. And a lot of universities, remember Earthwatch and CISL, and all do those sort of master's programs, which is great to see. It's an interesting discussion, which I mentioned earlier. I think, in terms of that personal experience and training is really important, just to understanding. But I just want to challenge that a bit, because when you're a board member, once you're sitting behind that desk and have the accountabilities and responsibilities of the businesses, things change. When it gets down to the bottom line, you're accountable for this action or outcome. Is it really sort of your personal experiences which is going there, or is it businesses? So people do act differently once they have that accountability and responsibility. So yes, it's important and does help enhance the discussions and understanding. But the bottom line is in terms of boards and directors have to be accountable for their actions.
Yeah, agree. There is sort of that structural fiduciary responsibility that they're not going to walk away from. I wouldn't either. Now, we've had some questions in the chat. They have been answered both by the speakers and in comments in the chat. Does anybody else have another question? I can go on and on with my questions, so I want to make sure that I'm giving the floor to some. If you could put your hand up or write it in the chat, that's good, because we've got quite a big crew on, and I can't see all the screen at the same time. So if you have a question and you'd like to say it, this is your time. Okay, so then I have one closing question for each of the speakers, and I would encourage you to be short and snappy in the answers. If you had a magic wand, what one or two things would you do to move this agenda forward in the UK? Who would like to go first?
I don't mind. I can have a go anyway.
Fantastic,
it's a great
fantastic
question, so thank you. To be honest, particularly at this time, businesses are wanting political and business leadership. They want direction and leadership from the top of the house. And remember, the CEOs, directors, on a day-to-day basis, are sort of engaging with at that sort of political level. It's difficult, it's easy, but we just need to see some real leadership in businesses and government together collectively, and pushing the agenda both into the nature and climate.
Yeah, so let's scale up leadership. I agree with you, Mark. Who next?
I can follow on from that quickly.
Thank you, Emma.
It's short and sweet. It's mandating the TNFD. So
Whoop.
I think it's going with the stick rather than the carrot.
I always like a good stick. That's good. No?
Can I just reinforce what Emma has said, and Mark? I've never come across a serious, responsible business that doesn't want good regulation. Because good regulation, properly formed, properly implemented, properly resourced, sets the expectation, it weeds out the cowboys, and it gives good companies a launch pad to go further. So the sooner regulators and politicians around the world understand that businesses are not concerned about regulation, they're concerned about bad regulation, the quicker this would all move on. We all want rules. Life is about rules. Politicians seem to run away from rules. We're having the same debate about social media and phones for kids, when it's absolutely blindly obvious what the answer is.
Thank you. Thank you, Noel. Graham.
No, just to sort of echo that, really, that it has to be good regulation. People like working within a structure and a framework, but to be perfectly honest with you, some of the stuff that's been coming out over the past couple of years from Europe, it's patently obvious that the regulation hasn't been written by anybody that understands business. And provided we can get something that's understandable and doesn't have too many four-letter acronyms in it, and we stand half a chance.
So is that your magic wand?
My magic wand would be to make sure that the people that write the rules for the regulation and the reporting actually understand what they're talking about.
Okay, so there's an issue for universities perhaps to also educate policymakers on business and nature. So perhaps Exeter can pick that up. Ryan, what is your magic wand telling us?
Yeah, it leads nicely to mine actually, which is to sort of make invisible or disappear all the barriers between academia, as a social scientist, and business and policy. I think through the research we had several examples of people giving excellent case studies, but then saying, "Oh, but you can't use that." And then also some people who had agreed to engage with the project and then maybe thinking a bit too much about it and pulling out. So I'd really love this sort of openness institutionally. Would be really fantastic.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, thank you all of the speakers and researchers. Emma, if you could please put the download QR code back on, I will do a very short wrap up, but if we can do that, and I think if we can have a round of applause for our speakers. I won't clap too loud, but we can do it virtually. Thank you, everybody. And particularly thank you, I think, to the Renew team that's actually created a really good guide. The world is definitely getting more difficult when you work in climate and nature. Certainly my academic colleagues in the US have had significant pressure to scale back on climate science, biodiversity science. We've seen a lot of shifts in terms of just job losses, whether that's in the universities or that's in the government agencies. And some of that is contagious around the world, that there is sort of a freeze going on. It's not just green hushing, it's almost a green freezing in some ways. But at the same time, from the conversations I have, whether that's with business leaders that I work with, including, fantastic leaders in business like Andre Hoffman, who's chairman of Roche, or Andrew Forrest, who's founder and CEO of Fortescue. It's Australia's largest mining company. It's a huge company. Their unfailing commitment and actually accelerating commitment to the issue of business and nature is inspirational. So I think we need this kind of research-based, but I think very rigorous business engaged types of publications. So congratulations to Noel and Ryan, Patrick, who also helped, and the rest of the Renew team for doing what I think is a very a fantastic report. Certainly, we would love to be in touch, and we've got on screen here how to contact Noel, also how to contact Ed Price from my team, who is at the Nature and Climate Impact team, who can take some of these things forward. Ryan, if you could please put your contact details in the chat, I think that would be also useful. I'm sure people would like to be in touch with you. And I think if I can close right on the dot here, is if there's one thing that my magic wand would give us all, and that would give us more courage. So it builds on what Mark said. It's about leadership, but I have to say that really what's going to win the day right now is courage. Courage to face the challenge, face the reality, and courage to actually have that first mover and get that advantages. So on behalf of Renew and the University of Exeter, I'd like to say thank you for everybody that attended. We were over 50 at our height, which I think is a fantastic size for a webinar on this topic. So thanks, everybody. Look forward to continuing this conversation.